Hello and welcome to lesson 15 of this basic biblical Greek course. Lesson 15 also brings us to the end of the second phase of this course. So well done on persevering and hanging in there. In today's lesson, we're going to be treading in some very deep waters as we continue learning about the various aorist tense forms. So today we're looking specifically at the second aorist indicative. So we'll do an overview to begin with. Then we'll move on to the second aorist active and middle indicative forms. Thereafter, we will look at the first aorist second passive forms. In the previous lesson, we dealt specifically with the first passive forms. So here we will look at the second passive forms. And then I would like to provide you with an aorist passive methodology that I hope will simplify things for you. And then we'll finish off with some vocab and translation work. And as I promised you, I would do a few more exercises with you because the last lesson was quite congested. So if you're ready, grab your cup of coffee and let's get going together. In the previous lesson, I told you that there are two ways to form the aorist tense in Greek. So lesson 15 dealt primarily with the first aorist, or you could think of it as the regular way of forming the aorist tense. Regular because, as it says there, they generally do not have a stem change. We also learned that the first aorist is characterized by a tense formative, which is the sigma alpha. And then, just to encourage you, most Greek verbs follow the first aorist pattern. And then, lastly, the first aorist first passive is characterized by a theta eta. So those are just a few of the things that we learned in lesson 15. So if these things still sound very foreign to you and are confusing to you, then please take the time to go and re-watch lesson 15 and solidify these concepts for yourself. But today we are looking at the second aorist, or you can think of it as the irregular way of forming the aorist tense. So you can expect a stem change, and in light of this stem change, there are major and minor stem changes. Let's consider some of these changes together. So let's talk about major and minor changes for a minute. What do I mean by major changes? This is when the stem change is drastic. All right, so there's a major change that takes place. So for example, when the verb uses different roots altogether. So let's do some examples together, and they probably are going to shock you because they are so drastic in their change. The first one is horao, which, if you remember from your previous vocab, means I see. And the second aorist is idon. So as you can see there, the verb uses different roots altogether. There is no similarity between the second aorist and its actual lexical form. The second example is lego, which, if you remember, means I say, and its second aorist form is apon, which once again is very different from the present tense form. And then we have erkamai, which means I come or I go, and the second aorist is elthon. Right, so all of these examples here show you that the verb uses different roots altogether, and that's why we have a major or a drastic change. And then we also have minor changes. Most of the time, the stem change is small. So for example, even though there is a change, one can still recognize the original roots. So look at these three examples with me. The first one is balo, which means I cast or I throw. In the second aorist, it becomes e balon. So there's a small change there, which allows us to still recognize the original roots. So you can still recognize the bal of the root in the second aorist. So the only change there is there's a simplification of the double consonant. The one lambda has dropped out. Our second example is lepo, which means I leave, and that becomes e lepon. So once again, you can recognize the original root, and here we have a small vowel change that's taken place. And then the final example, heurisco, which means I found, becomes euron. So once again, you can recognize the verbal root there. All right, so I hope that just gives you an overview of the major and minor changes that you can expect in the second aorist tense forms. So let's begin by looking at the components of the second aorist active indicative verb forms. So firstly, we see that they are augmented. The second aorist is augmented just like the imperfect and the first aorist to show past action. The tense form, it says there, the second aorist tense stem is different from the present tense stem. The reason for this is to be able to distinguish it from the imperfect. So the present tense stem that we've been working with is lu. So the second aorist tense stem that we're going to use is elepon to show that there's been a stem change. The tense formative, the second aorist has no tense formative. Connecting vowels, the second aorist uses the same connecting vowels as the present tense. And why is this? Is because there is no sigma alpha. And then finally, personal endings. The second aorist active indicative uses secondary endings because it is also augmented. This means it has the same personal endings as the imperfect. And we'll talk more about these similarities just now. So let's have a look at a visual diagram of all these components. So the reason why I show you diagrams like this is because I'm a visual learner, and I'm sure some of you who are watching these videos are also visual learners. So let's zero in on this diagram together and look at the second aorist active components very quickly. So we see that there's an augment, which is the epsilon once again. The tense stem is lip. All right, and just a comment here, as I mentioned previously, the second aorist stem of lepo is lip. All right, to show you that there's been a stem change, but more importantly, to help us distinguish it from the imperfect. And once again, we have connecting vowels, either the omicron or the epsilon, because there's no tense formative. There's no sigma alpha, which we found with the first aorist components. And then the second aorist also takes secondary personal endings. So let's turn our attention now to the second aorist active endings with lip. And I've given you two tables here. Let's call this table 1 and this one table 2. And I'd like to begin by looking at the similarities between these two forms. So if you look carefully regarding the similarities, you can see that the endings are identical. The endings are identical. So let me just highlight those for you. And as I highlight them, I want to ask you, why are they identical? Okay, well, to answer that question, Table 1 shows us the second aorist active endings, and Table 2 are the imperfect active endings. And both of these tense forms take secondary active personal endings. The new, the sigma, the third person singular doesn't have an ending. The men, the te, and the new. So both of them take the same endings. Let's now talk about the differences between them. And as you can see, the only difference is that the second aorist has undergone a stem change. Right, because the lexical form of the word is lepo, which means I leave. So as you can see here in the second table, which conveys the imperfect active forms, we can see that the stem has not undergone any stem changes. But the first table, the second aorist active endings, LAPO has undergone a stem change. So we can see there that there's been a small vowel change where the epsilon has fallen away. So now we are left with lip. All right, so a very small change, but a change nonetheless, because it will affect how we translate this verb. The imperfect we would translate as I was leaving, and the second aorist we would translate as I left. So I hope this shows you the importance of knowing the lexical forms of the verbs, so that if there is a stem change that has taken place, that you would be able to recognize it. So I just want to reinforce the importance of memorization. Because the stem changes often only involve one letter, it is extremely important to memorize the verbal root and lexical form exactly. So we've done the first example together, but just go through it again. So we have lepo, which is the present tense form, and that becomes elepon in the imperfect. But in the second aorist it becomes elepon with a slight stem change. Look at the second example with me. We have balo, which in the imperfect becomes e balon, and the second aorist becomes e balon. So once again, a very small stem change. And the only way that you will recognize that a stem change has taken place is if you know what the lexical forms were originally. So I want to encourage you to learn your vocab. That's why it is so crucial to spend the time learning that vocab, because it starts coming into play now with these various differences in these tense forms. Let us now quickly talk about how we would translate the second aorist active indicative. So we're going to translate it very much like we did with the first aorist active, which means that we're going to translate it with a simple English past action, which conveys a whole or entire action, not focusing on its beginning, progression, culmination, or results. So let's go through those forms very quickly again. We have elepon, elepes, elepen, elepamen, elepete, and elepon. And we would translate that as elepon, I left, elepes, you left, elepen, he or she, it left, elepamen, we left, elepete, you left, and elepon, they left. And just a translation tip here for us. When you translate an inflected verbal form, ask yourself, am I looking at the present tense stem or not? If it is the present tense stem, then you may be looking at a present or imperfect. And if the stem is different, all right, in other words, if there's been a stem change, you may be looking at a second aorist. Now, let's look at the second aorist middle components. And I'm not going to spend too much time here because the components are the same as the second aorist active components. The only difference is that the components take the secondary middle passive endings instead of the secondary active endings. But the augment, the tense stem, and the connecting vowels are all the same. So the second aorist middle endings with lip, remember that they take the secondary middle passive endings. Let me remind you of those. The singulars are main, sa, and ta. The plural, metha, iste, and on, ta. We are also using the stem lip once again to show that there's been a stem change. And then we have the augments on the front. So let's go through these together. The first person singular is ele parmain. Second person singular is ele pu. And just to remind you why it's ele pu, remember that the true ending for the second person singular is sa, all right, as you can see here. However, the sigma cannot stand between two vowels, so it would have been asa, ele pasa. So the sigma falls away, and then the two omicrons contract to form u. And that is why we have the modified ending u instead of sa. The third person singular is ele peta. First person plural is ele pa metha. The second person plural is ele peste. And the third person plural is ele panta. And as you should be aware of already, the only way that you're going to differentiate between the second aorist middle and the imperfect middle forms are by recognizing that a stem change has taken place. And then regarding the translation of the second aorist middle indicative, ele parmain, we would translate as I left for myself. Ele pu, you left for yourself. Ele peta, he or she or it left for himself or itself or herself. Ele parmetha, we left for ourselves. Ele peste, you left for yourselves. And then finally, ele panta, they left for themselves. Because remember, we're looking at the middle voice, and the middle voice tells us that the subject acts in its own interest or for itself. Before we look specifically at the first aorist second passive, I'd like to do some quick revision of the first aorist first passive components, which we did in lesson 15. So there was an augment. The tense stem was lu, because no stem change takes place with the first aorist. The tense formative, if you remember, was the theta eta to show the first passive. And then the first aorist first passive took secondary active personal endings. So keep that in mind, because you might have a tendency to think, well, I'm working with a passive voice, it's going to take secondary middle passive endings. But actually, it takes active secondary endings. And then because the theta eta ends in a vowel, a connecting vowel is not needed. Right, so these are things that we covered in lesson 15. So if you can't remember this, please go back to lesson 15 to just refresh your memory. And then the first aorist first passive endings with lu. Let's go through the forms together. The singular, we have elu thein. Second person singular, elu theis. Third person singular, elu thei. First person plural, elu thei men. Second person plural, elu thei te. And third person plural, elu thei son. And just a quick observation here. Remember that the third person plural takes the longer son rather than the shorter nu. Now that we've done some revision of the first aorist first passive, let's now move on to the first aorist second passive and look at the components. The first thing that I want to say here is that the first aorist second passive, we are going to use grapho, which means I write. And in the case of this particular verb, grapho, the second aorist stem is not different from the present stem. Right, so have a look here. Grapho, the stem is gruff, and the stem of the first aorist second passive is agraphein. Right, so you can see here that no stem change takes place. And the biggest difference that you're going to see between the first aorist first passive and the first aorist second passive is that the theta is going to be replaced by a phi. Right, let's go through the components very quickly. We have an augment once again. The tense stem is actually gruff. All right, so what I've done there, I've just moved the phi across to show you that it's replacing the theta. But you could actually think of the tense formative as actually being the eta. And then it also takes secondary active personal endings. So let's practice conjugating the first aorist second passive endings with grapho. So remember that the first aorist second passive also takes secondary active personal endings. The new, the sigma, the third person singular, as you know by now, has no ending. Men, te, and new. All right, so let's go through this together. First person singular is agraphein. Second person singular, agraphes. Third person singular, agraphe. First person plural, agraphemen. Second person plural, agraphete. And third person plural, agrapheson. All right, so once again, the biggest difference is that the characteristic of the aorist second passive is that it takes the same endings as the aorist first passive but omits the theta and is now replaced by the phi. All right. Now, I must be honest with you. When it comes to the aorist and the passive voice, it can become very confusing, and I often get confused. And so I want to make this as simple as possible. So let's quickly look at an overview of the aorist second passives. The first thing that I want you to be aware of is that it's not common, and that should encourage you. The New Testament only has 32 words that occur in the first aorist second passive form. All right, so when it comes to the greater scheme of the Greek New Testament, it's the first aorist second passive is very rare. And then something that is also good to be aware of is that different grammars use different terminologies. And so if you have read a few different basic Greek grammars or even intermediate grammars, you may have recognized this already, but many grammars call this a second aorist passive. So I've been calling it a first aorist second passive, but some grammars simply call it a second aorist passive, and just want to make you aware of that. However, the only difference between the first aorist first passive and the first aorist second passive is this. All right, so let's break it down to its bare minimum basics. The only difference between them is, first of all, the presence or absence, respectively, of the theta. Is the theta there or is it not there? And then the second one is the second aorist second passive, on the other hand, has a stem change. So here's a simple methodology to learn the types of aorist passives. The first part of the methodology. There are two factors that affect the formation of the aorist passive. The first factor, a stem change. Second factor, the presence or omission of the theta. And then the second part of the methodology, there are 4 ways to form the aorist passive. The first way, no stem change and includes a theta. Second way, no stem change but does not include a theta. Third way, stem change and includes a theta. And fourth way, stem change but does not include a theta. So let's make sense of this information now. So using the methodology, here is a summary of the types of aorist passives. So if you can remember this table, I think it's going to save you a lot of time and energy and frustration going forward as you learn Greek. So here we have the first aorist passives, all right, and I've summarized this as the first aorist first passives. And what does that actually mean? It means that there is no stem change and includes a theta. So there's an example. Luo becomes elu thein. So no stem change and it includes a theta. Then the first aorist second passive. There is no stem change, but it does not include a theta. So here's an example. We have grapho, and that becomes graphein. Right, so no stem change, and the theta is now replaced by the phi. Right, so that's what we've been learning in lesson 15 and also in this lesson. And then we also have the second aorist passives, which can be divided up into second aorist first passives. And what does that mean? It means that there is a stem change and it includes a theta. So here's an example. We have ago, and that becomes ek thein. So stem change, and it includes a theta. And then the second aorist second passives, there's a stem change, but does not include a theta. So our example here is strepho, which becomes estraphein. So there's a stem change and the theta has been replaced by the phi. So this table, this methodology has really helped me to learn and to understand the differences between the different types of aorist passives. I think if you can just remember that when you talk about a first aorist, there's no stem change. When you speak about the second aorist, there is a stem change, and then you need to ask yourself, is there the presence or the omission of the theta? And if you can do that, I believe you'll be A for away. So the vocab for this lesson is very, very important. And so I really want you to discipline yourself and take the time to learn the vocab for this lesson, because most of the vocab are examples of second aorist verbs that have undergone a stem change. So the vocab for today's lesson is listed as the second aorist verbs, which are underlined for you now. And then I've also put some words in brackets, and that is the lexical form of that second aorist verb. So let me first underline all the second aorist verbs. A lot of them are the major changes, the drastic changes that have undergone, that have happened to them as they've moved from the present to the second aorist. All right, then I've also put the lexical form in brackets so you can just remind yourself of where that word actually comes from. So you should know these already if you've been doing your vocab, and now you just need to learn the second aorist forms. All right, so let's begin with the first one. We have apathanon, which comes from apathanasko, and that means I died. Then we have a verb, arko, which can have two meanings. It means I rule if it's with the active voice, and then it can also mean I begin if it's with the middle voice, and the middle voice is arkamai, which I haven't put there, so that's why I'm saying it for you. The middle voice is arkamai. Then we have a noun, didaskalos ha, should I say, which means teacher. Then we have balon, which comes from balo, and it means I cast or I threw. Then we have egenomein, which comes from ginomai, and that means I became. Then we have idon, which comes from horao, which means I saw. Then we have ipon, which comes from lego, and it means I said. Then we have elebon, which comes from lambano, I received. Next we have elepon, which comes from lepon. We've been practicing this one, which means I left. And then we have eskon, which comes from echo, and it means I had. Then we have huron, which comes from heurisco, and that means I found. Then we have agagon, which comes from ago, and it means I led. Then we have ailthon, which comes from erkamai, and that means I came or I went. And finally, we have uketi, and when you see u, it should tell you that it's a negative, and this means no longer. So our first example reads as follows: ha, theos, autos, elthen, en, te, doxe, autu, kai, edidaxen, tois, anthropois, tois, kakois, tein, aletheon. So let's pass one or two words here first. The first one I want to pass is autos. It's a third person personal pronoun. It's in the nominative case, masculine gender, singular person, and the vocab is he. Then we've got eilthen, which you should recognize from your vocab. This is a verb, it's a second aorist. So notice that I am very specific about what type of aorist it is. A second aorist, indicating that it is a stem change. It's an active voice, indicative, third person singular. And the vocab, it comes from eilthon, and its lexical source is erkamai. All right, so you need to know that erkamai is its lexical source, which means I come or I go. And in the second aorist, it becomes eilthon. And then we have edidaxen. This is a verb, but it's a first aorist. Why? Because there's no stem change. It's an active, indicative, third person singular, and it means teach. All right, so let's translate this verse. And what I've done, I've translated it for us first. So let's bring it up on the screen. And now I want to make some observations about this text. So let's translate it first. It is, God himself came in his glory and taught the truth to the evil men. Right, so the first thing I want you to notice is that the subject of this verse is God in the nominative case, but then it's God himself. And that's because autos, being a third person personal pronoun, is standing in the predicate position, which means it's there for emphasis. And therefore we translate it as God himself. And then we have Eilthen, which is I come, but now it's the second aorist, so we need to translate it as a past action with a perspective as looking at it as a whole. So we translated God himself came in te doxe, in his glory. All right, there's the possessive pronoun autu for his, kai, and then we have edidaxen, which is taught in the past tense, and then we have tois anthropois, tois kakois. And there our adjective is kakois, standing in the attributive position, so it is modifying anthropois, which is men. So that's why I translated it as the evil men. And then we have tain aletheon, which is the truth. So you might be wondering why I translated tain aletheon, the truth, before the evil men. And the reason for that is because tain aletheon is in the accusative case, telling me that it is functioning as the direct object. So I've placed the direct object straight after the transitive verb taught. So taught what? The truth. And then we have tois anthropois, tois kakois in the dative case, telling me it's the indirect object. So God himself came in his glory and taught the truth. Who did he teach the truth to? To the evil men. Let's look at our second example together. So the Greek text reads, haute, he, epangelia, egraphe, humin, hoi, pestu usin, hoti, ha, Iesus, esti kurios. So I just want to pass one word here. First, we have egraphe, which is a verb, and it's a first aorist because there's no stem change, but it's a second passive. Why? Because of the presence of the phi. It's indicative, third person singular. It comes from grapho, which means teach. Right, so once again, I've done the translation for us, and then I'll make some observations about the text. So it reads as, this promise was written to you who are believing that Jesus is Lord. All right, so we begin with this demonstrative pronoun, haute. It's standing in the predicate position, and it is modifying the subject, he epangelia, which is promise. So it's not just any promise, it's pointing out that it's a specific promise, so we translated this promise. Egraphe, which is our first aorist second passive, it's past tense, and to show the passive voice, we use the helping verb was, so that this promise was written, and it was written humin, which is the indirect object, to you. And then we have hoi. Hoi is a relative pronoun. It's in the nominative case. So it's actually functioning as the subject of the verb pestu usin, which is are believing. All right, so the relative pronoun hoi is translated as who, the subject of who is believing, to you who are believing. And then we have hoti, which could be translated as that or because, but I've used that. And then we have hoi, Jesus, Jesus, esti is Lord. All right, and because we have a linking verb or a copulative verb, that tells us that Kyrios, Lord, is functioning as a predicate nominative in this verse. Let's take a look at our third example together. The Greek reads as follows: Egeneta ha theos sarx kai apethanen huper hemon ala nun mene ente basileia autu. So let's pass two words here, two verbs specifically. We have egeneta, which is a second aorist because it has a stem change. It's a middle voice. You can recognize it there by the personal endings eta. It's indicative, third person singular, and it comes from egenomein. And its lexical source, if you're not too sure, is from genomai, which is I become. And then we have apethanen, which is also a second aorist verb because of a stem change. It's an active voice, indicative, third person singular, and it comes from apethanen. And if you're not too sure of the lexical source, I've put it here, apathanesko, which is death or I die. All right, so if we had to translate this, we could come up with something like this. God became flesh and died on our behalf, but now he is remaining in his kingdom. All right, so let's look at the details here. We see that our subject is ha theos, so that is God. And then we have egeneta, which is actually a linking verb. And because it's the second aorist, we translate it as past tense. So it's God became. And then we have sarx, flesh. And there sarx is functioning as a predicate nominative because it comes directly after a linking verb. Kai and apethanen, all right, and died, and then we have huper, which is our preposition, which is on behalf. But then we have the first person personal pronoun, which is our. So God became flesh and died on our behalf. Then we have our conjunction, but, nun, now, mene, which is a present, active indicative. Now he is remaining. And then we have this prepositional phrase, en te basileia autu, in his kingdom.